Statseeker alerts can be triggered in response to the content of either a syslog or SNMP trap message that's been forwarded to the Statseeker server, or to the creation of an event record resulting from a state change, such as device ping or SNMP states, interface admin or OPER status changes, UPS battery status changes, basically a change in any monitored state or status. Now, these event records are automatically created by Statseeker. You don't need to configure anything to generate them, you just need to configure the alert that you want to trigger in response to the state change. Now, the final trigger is another type of event record, and that's event records created in response to a threshold breach. In this instance, you need to configure both the threshold and the alert. And there's a separate video looking at threshold configuration. Thresholds can be set against any time series metric. Think link utilization and data rates, temperatures, CPU and memory loads, that sort of thing. Essentially, any data that you might want to view in a graph, you can set a threshold against it and alert on threshold breaches. The alert output that Statseeker generates can be in the form of an email or a syslog message that the server sends on to a collector that you define, or Statseeker can run a script. This allows the alerting functionality to accomplish any multi-step complex task or integrate into a third-party product that you might have in use in your organization. Alright, so let's have a quick look at configuring alerts. We head to the admin tool, alerting and event management, alerting, and add a new alert. The first option is the alert template. From what we saw earlier, this is the output of the alert. What type of alert do you want to configure? Do you want to send an email, forward a syslog message, or run a script? We'll start with a simple email template. Name your alert. Let's start with a basic device down alert. The status is simply, is the alert enabled? You can disable an alert but maintain the configuration for later use. Also, if you're halfway through an alert configuration and you have to move on to another task, disable the alert before you save it. Otherwise, it will be in play and sending alerts based on your partial configuration. The alert type is the input for the alert, what's going to trigger the alert. And from what we mentioned earlier, we have events. That's your infrastructure, state and status change events, syslog and SNMP trap message content, and your threshold breaches. I'll set alert type to event. Now, for the data type, we have the common data types, and this will be the same for all servers. And the second section is a dynamic list, so yours may look a little different to mine. It will display any other data type that your server is currently monitoring, which contains a status or state field. For our ping down alert, we could select device or ping. So what's the difference? Statseeker allows for multiple ping pollers to be distributed throughout your network, so you can monitor the availability of critical infrastructure from multiple locations. Now, when multiple pollers are available, each device has a designated default poller, but can have any number of additional pollers monitoring the device. When data type equals device and field equals ping state, the alert will only respond to ping state changes recorded by the default poller. But when data type is set to ping and the field is ping state, the alert can be configured to respond to ping state changes recorded by any number of specified pollers, including the default poller. If you're interested in distributed polling, then you can refer to documentation and videos on Statseeker's observability appliances, or alternatively contact Statseeker sales or support for more information around this functionality. So I'm going to proceed with data type of device, set my field to ping state, and specify the states I want to be alerted to, disabled and down. If you're ever unsure of the definition for a state, refer to the API endpoint reference documentation for the specified data type. Let me show you. Help menu, down to the API doco, select the endpoint reference. Now the index is by the endpoint name, and if you're familiar with the API then you're fine. If not, the entry that you select in the data type lists, like in the alerting configuration, that's the endpoint title that we see here, so we'll just search for that. I'm after the device, and we can see that the internal name is CDT device. We're after the ping state, and here are the states and their definitions. Anyway, back to the alert. We have our data type, our field, and the state selected. Entity and group filters. I can leave the filter network-wide or select a specific device or group of devices. Now, grouping is fundamental to filtering Statseeker alerts, thresholds, dashboards and reports, so look to the documentation and videos on grouping if you're not familiar with it. Next, we have a time filter. Again, I can leave it open 24/7 or restrict it to alert to events that occur within a specified time range. We have the custom option here, which allows me to configure a basic time range and an option to head off to the advanced time filter editor to create and test a complex time filter. You'll want to use this one if you need to include multiple ranges or exclusion periods in your time filter. Again, there's doco and video around doing each of those things if you aren't familiar with the advanced time filter editor. I'll drop in some basic business hours and I can set up another alert for how to deal with the switch events outside of hours. So Monday to Friday, 6:30 AM to 6 PM. And once you add a custom time filter, that time filter is added to the list for use in subsequent alert configurations. The time filter mode determines how Statseeker deals with an active event at the start of a time filter period. In our case, if a device went down prior to the alerting period and was still down at the start of that period, do you want to ignore it or do you want to be notified that it's currently down? The time zone applies to your time filter. If you have a remote office and you want to restrict the alerts to the business hours of that remote office, you can simply drop in business hours and then set the time zone. No need to calculate the time difference between your server and the location. The logging option we see here can be enabled when troubleshooting alerting issues. Alerting always logs out to the Statseeker messages log, but when this option is enabled, we expand on that default level of logging, and it can be a little noisy, so it's off by default. Bundling allows you to bundle up individual alert messages and send them together. This might be useful when a device goes down and you lose connectivity to everything behind it. It'll stop you being bombarded with individual alert messages for all the devices. Although in this case, a better option might be to use the advanced email template and enable upstream device configuration, but we'll get to that one in a little bit. And the last option is who do you want to email? Drop in an address, select a Statseeker user or a group that contains Statseeker users. I can use the check event filters to apply the config to the content of our events database to see if any recent events satisfy the alert conditions. This is useful if you are creating an alert in response to behavior you know to be occurring, and more so when you've got multiple or complex filter conditions. You can ensure that you're targeting the right events and only those events. We also have the aptly named preview test email option, which allows you to, as it says, preview a test email. It grabs the most recent entry in the events database that would satisfy your alerting config and previews the email that would be sent if that event occurred once this alert was in play. We have the name of my Statseeker server, the name of the device, and state triggering the alert and the time the event occurred. We also have the option to actually send a test alert email, and this can be used to confirm that your Statseeker email server configuration is working as intended. If you need to update something there, admin tool, Statseeker administration, email configuration. In here you can review and edit and test your email server config and see the current mail queue. When you're happy with your alert configuration, save it. The custom content template allows you to customize the email content. You get an HTML editor with the ability to format text, insert images and tables, and include links out from the alert to reports, dashboards, or external systems. You also have the option to insert variables in your email subject line and body. These variables can pass through details of the event triggering the alert, the time the device stopped responding to ping, the name of the device, the ping state that triggered the alert, and additional data regarding the entity responsible for the alert. Because we're looking at a device event, we have access to fields relating to that device. If this were an interface alert, we'd have the general section, an interface section containing details around the interface, and that list would also contain a link to the parent device, so we'd have access to all of the device fields too. And this is where the preview test email becomes very helpful. I've customized the content and I can preview the output. Now, you can see that I've included a link to the device overview dashboard. you can also reference the variables in the link configuration in order to filter the dashboard contents. Then when we open the dashboard, it's already filtered to the device that I want to look at. In my link config, I've just gone and opened a dashboard in another tab and copied the URL, then manually added the URL parameter to set the dashboard variable. Now, you can refer to the alerting documentation for details if you aren't familiar with the syntax that we use here. When bundling is in place, email content featuring variables is repeated for every instance of the alert being triggered within the bundling period. Specifically, each table row, list item, or paragraph of text, which includes at least one variable, will be repeated. And this will make a little bit more sense when we look at it. Here's an alert config to demonstrate the behavior. I've enabled bundling for 10 minutes from the first instance of a trigger. Now we have a table header row and a content row. The header row doesn't contain a variable, but the content row does. So the content row will be repeated for every event that occurs in the bundling period. This paragraph won't be repeated, but this one will. Likewise with my list entries. I'll hit preview, and we can now see how multiple events are presented when bundling alerts. Now, the mode option can be used to instruct the Statseeker mail server on which format to send an email alert, either HTML or raw text. Raw text will strip formatting, images, links, that sort of thing. The HTML setting sends both HTML and raw content, and if the receiving mail client can't pass the HTML content, it'll just fall back to the raw content. The advanced email template expands your customization options, including some really nice features. We now have multiple trigger configurations. Now there's a logical OR in place here. If any one of my filters is satisfied, the alert is generated, allowing multiple triggers within a single alert configuration. The bundling options have been expanded. We now have bundle times. Let's say that this alert was to target non-critical infrastructure. I'll just change the name and filter to a different group of devices and set bundling from the end of business hours through to 6 a.m. on the next business day. So each morning I get a single email which details all of the down events for these devices since the end of business the previous day. And all down events which occur over a weekend are bundled up for me first thing on Monday morning. The waiting option that we see here addresses a very specific use case. When you have multiple triggers, one of which is a down event, and you have bundling rules in play, you can specify an alternate action to take with regard to bundling when a down event occurs. The upstream devices option. Now, this uses defined network topography to suppress alerts for downstream devices when the defined upstream device is unreachable. Let's say a firewall at a remote office falls over. With this feature enabled and with the downstream device configuration in place, you only get the alert for the firewall rather than the alert for the firewall and then additional alerts for every device behind it, which because the firewall is down, is also now unreachable. There's a 2-minute video which provides an overview of the upstream device feature and the configuration, and there's documentation which goes into detail. Check them out if you're interested in using the feature. The next addition in the advanced template is the recipient roster. Upload a text file containing your roster, and emails for this alert will be sent to recipients according to the roster. The syntax for the roster file is detailed in the alerting documentation. Date-time syntax, row syntax, and an example. Alternate date-time formats to use in the email. These are applied to any instance of a date-time variable in the email subject or body. And lastly, we've got a formatting option. The other alert template options are the syslog and script. We'll look at syslog. We have the same multiple filter blocks from the advanced email template. Drop in the IP of the target syslog collector and your message format. We have the traditional Statseeker syslog format and a flexible JSON format. The JSON format contains all of the data from the Statseeker message and offers some additional configuration data for the message source device. And lastly, the script template. Drop in the command to run a shell script, including any operational parameters required. Now, the script will be run as the server's Statseeker user account, so be sure to set the appropriate file permissions for access and execution of your script. So we've had a quick look at the various alerting templates and how to configure filters. The last item to look at is some of the variations in the alert trigger that we skipped over on our way through the templates. I'll just use this script configuration. So the alert type is syslog, data type is device, and we have a regex field for filtering on the incoming syslog messages for the trigger we're after. I'll drop in an interface state change to down and check my filter against recent events. There we go, and I can save the alert. The SNMP trap trigger is the same configuration options as we just saw looking at syslog. And lastly, when configuring alerts for breaches of your custom thresholds, you simply select the threshold, the breach state that you want to alert on, and apply any additional filters you might want. Now remember, the filters that you define in the alert will be in addition to any filters that are already applied in your threshold configuration. But you can always use check event filters to ensure that you have your filters correctly configured. And that's a run through basic alert configuration in Statseeker.